Welcome to the Wade Center's podcast.
A podcast of Wheaton College. I wanted to mention, going back to Tolkien, that he wasn't very pleased with his service. He never really came to grips with the enemy. Lewis was more or less satisfied with himself as a military veteran. In Out of the Silent Planet, he says that Ransom discovered that he had rather more courage and reserve than he expected. Whereas Tolkien writes in letters and says, I had too much imagination and not enough courage. And he describes himself at one point as baggage because he was so often weak and wounded. He needed to be carried around on a litter. And it's interesting to me in Lord of the Rings that the hobbits, before they really get a chance to make their contribution, they say, oh, I'm just luggage. I shouldn't even be here. I have nothing to contribute. Tolkien said of Faramir, he says, the character I most identify with is Faramir, except I don't have his courage.
Wow. Welcome to the Wade Center podcast. And today we are sitting in our basement, kind of like a bomb shelter, I suppose, in order to talk about the Great War, which affected all of our Wade authors except for George MacDonald, because he died in 1905. David, you have interest in war history. Why don't you give us a brief background of what generated what is known as the Great War?
There's a whole Wikipedia thing called The Causes of World War I, and there's a study center called the Center for the Causes of World War I. So it's a very confusing topic. It's, what caused it all to happen. Americans tend to think of it as World War I. It was called the Great War until World War II, an even greater war came along. World War I was fought from August 1914 and the armistice in November 1918. So it was 4 years of war, engulfed all of Europe, the Middle East. America got involved in 1917. There's a classic book by Paul Fussell called The Great War in Modern Memory. And he says that the Great War actually was a catalyst for literary modernism. People were so disillusioned. The whole 19th century, there was a feeling of things are getting better through social reform, through education, through health reform. And they also thought they'd done away with the need for war because there were all these alliances. Joseph LeConte has written an interesting book called A Hobbit, a Wardrobe, and a Great War. And he quotes all these people in 1912 saying, I don't think we'll have any wars for at least a century. We've figured out how to avoid war. But he also has all these great quotations about, well, if there was a war, we know that God is on our side. And so it would be a short war. So it was a very traumatic event. There's a famous statement, the lights are going out all over Europe. They felt that civilization was being eclipsed by this great barbaric war.
Wow.
Our authors were all affected, everyone except for George MacDonald. All of our Wade authors either served on the battlefront or were affected by knew others who served. So we want to talk about the effect on our authors, which is actually different from the effect that Paul Fussell talks about, which is literary modernism. They went the other direction. Lewis and Tolkien especially tended to write about older chivalric wars that really had meaning, as opposed to this huge meat grinder of the trenches of World War I.
David and Crystal, why was it called the Great War during that time frame? I know we call it World War I now because there was a Second World War, but why was it called the Great War then?
Well, part of it may be that H.G. Wells, soon after the war began, published a pamphlet that was called The War That Will End War. And over time, that phrase has been reinscribed to say the war that will end all wars.
Yeah.
So here was this worldwide conflict, and people just thought, okay, this is beyond anything before. This must end all conflict.
Right. And the Great War, that at that point, it was the First World War, in which it was Europe, it was the Middle East, it was Asia, Pacific Islands. And so they called it the Great War because it was the first global war. And also the level of casualties, we're talking somewhere between 25 and 40 million people dying, military and civilians.
Wow.
So the kind of impact it had on European countries, when Crystal and I visit England or France, you'll go to a small village and they'll have a monument to those who were killed in the Great War. And this small village will have 80 names on the monument.
Wow.
And sometimes 12 of the names all have the last surname.
Oh, wow.
It was father and son and lots of cousins. So its impact on the psyche of Europeans was much more profound than it was on Americans.
Yeah.
Well, in fact, the movie Saving Private Ryan is about one youth who had been killed, and they wanted to protect his brother so a family didn't lose two sons, because they had learned from the Great War that a whole family could be wiped out.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, wipe out entire families and towns and things like
Right.
that. Yeah, wow.
Well, actually, in Saving Private Ryan, it's three brothers that are all killed, and they're trying to protect the fourth brother.
Yeah.
So it was interesting because Lewis and Tolkien and Barfield all served in the war. Lewis and Tolkien were on the front lines. Even before the war began, Crystal, I'm going to turn things over to you to talk about Dorothy Sayers, but when Lewis was studying outside of London as a teenager, he saw a firefight, which was a German Zeppelin dropping bombs on London.
Oh, wow.
And he could see it from his home. He wrote to his father, "I hope this war is over before it gets anywhere near my precious person," not realizing that on his 19th birthday, he would arrive at the trenches in northern France.
Wow.
And Crystal, you mentioned Dorothy Sayers being in France when the war broke out.
Yes. August 1st is when Germany declared war on Russia.
Uh-huh.
And that was the day that Dorothy Sayers and one of her college friends arrived in France for their break from Oxford University.
Oh, wow. So they were on like a university break or vacation or kind of a thing?
Exactly. And then, so they were in Paris on August 1st, and then on August 2nd, they went to the French town of Tours. And of course, they had to make the crossing in a boat, and it's quite amusing to read Sayers' response, because for her, this was all very exciting. She wrote home on August 2nd, and August 2nd is when Germany invaded Belgium, and that was very significant for England because hundreds of refugees flocked into England from Belgium.
Oh.
So, and Sayers talks about refugees as well. But she says, she writes home and she says, "It is immensely exciting. The streets yesterday were enveloped in a thick cloud of dust from the continual rushing to and fro of motor cars. In a restaurant, it seemed odd to see the umbrella stand stuck full of swords." And she keeps going on. Oh, it's so fearfully thrilling. And she says, "I am beginning to enjoy myself immensely if only we can stay." So here is a 21-year-old college student pleading with her parents saying, "Oh, let us stay here. This is so interesting." And after a while, so on the 3rd is when French declares war on Germany, and then on August 4th is when England declares war on Germany. But Sayers just responded to it almost with the eye of a novelist and just capturing all the interesting things that were happening, one of which was a man petting the nose of his horse and crying over his horse as the horse was licking him because he had to give his horse away to the war effort. And so Sayers is describing all these cars and horses racing around and the dust going up. And she is just having the time of her life. Meanwhile, the woman who went with her on this vacation basically has a nervous breakdown.
Oh, no.
And she is flat on her back, can't even get out of bed.
Oh, wow.
And that's probably more the way I would be if I were in France. Yes, when the war broke out. And what's interesting, too, is doctors had to come care for her friend named Elsie. And Sayers writes home and says, they gave her something to give her a little pep. And the word sounds like cocaine.
Oh, no.
So they were giving her cocaine injections just because she just could not even get out of bed.
Well, that will give you pep. So they were right about that part. Yeah.
Wow, that's a way to treat, I guess, depression maybe is what?
Yeah.
Anxiety.
I don't know if cocaine helps with anxiety.
Definite anxiety. And we can talk about shell shock later.
Yeah.
But Sayers was right there when war broke out. So she is a great resource to get the non-military perspective of
Yeah.
what it was like and having trouble buying food.
Yeah.
And she would talk about this. We weren't able to get bread today, but it's so exciting.
Huh.
That is kind of typical. There's often an elation at the beginning of the war. The same thing happened with the American Civil War. There's so much tension built up that the actual declaration of war seems to relieve the tension.
Really?
And then they soon learn, yes, how
I've always
horrible
wondered
the whole
about that.
experience is.
I remember after 9/11 when we went into Afghanistan and some of my friends were excited, and I was like, I don't understand why you are excited about this. I've never understood that reaction to war. But there was definitely a lot of kind of romanticism and chivalry
right.
going into the war, and like you said, with modernist response, it seemed to have really like hit once they hit the trenches, that kind of veil came off their eyes and the reality of war sunk in.
I wanted to read a account from Lewis. He arrived on the lines in France on his 19th birthday.
Uh-huh.
And it was everything that you've seen from the movies like 1917 or the Tolkien biography.
Yeah.
Lewis says, how to forget that war, the frights, the cold, the smell of high explosive, the horribly smashed men still moving like half-crushed beetles, the sitting or standing corpses, the landscape of sheer earth without a blade of grass. That's from Surprised by Joy. And then Tolkien said in a letter, no one could imagine the sheer animal horror of the trenches unless he had been there. So they both had a very profound primal reaction to the horror of war on the trenches.
Yeah.
But you wonder how much different it is when somebody's writing from the start. So here was Sayers the day that war was declared. And she actually said, the pension owner where she and Elsie, her friend, were staying, they said, well, we can rely on the English to save us. And, and Sayers writes home, I felt rather proud to be British. But whereas Lewis, he's writing in Surprised by Joy after the fact, and you get a different perspective.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, he was traumatized for years. We're going to talk about shell shock or post-traumatic stress syndrome. Doug Gresham says that in the early 60s, when he was living with Lewis at the Kilns after Doug's mother, Joy Davidman Lewis, died, that he heard Lewis yelling and making a lot of noise downstairs. So he went to check on him. He thought it was a burglar. He took a baseball bat down there. And Lewis said, oh, don't worry, I'm just dreaming about the war again. So that's almost 40 years later, Lewis is still having nightmares. He said in one of his letters that the war haunted his dreams for years.
Wow.
Yeah. Well, the word shell shock was actually coined in 1915.
Oh, wow.
And it was just, they were trying to grapple with the response of all these soldiers coming back. And then for a while, they didn't want to talk about it because it was defined as emotional and they didn't want British to seem weak by being emotional. But after the war, they realized, oh my goodness, this has long-lasting effects. And interestingly, Sayers, as she went through the war, she wasn't as excited as on the first 4 days of the war because she had an uncle and a cousin who both had shell shock.
Oh.
And in her first novel, she gives Lord Peter Wimsey shell shock.
Oh.
And he actually goes into a state very similar to what you just described, David, that Gresham heard his stepfather go into, where he still remembers and he starts shouting as though he were still in the trenches.
Right. There's a scene in Lord of the Rings when they're at the inn at Bree where Aragorn is talking about the Black Riders. It's the first time he brings them up. And he says, you fear them, but you do not fear them enough. They are terrible. And it says, suddenly he clenched the arms of his chair and with a pained look on his face, as if listening for noises in the night or searching through distant memory. And to me, it's almost a PTSD moment.
Yeah.
Tolkien also served on the front line. He talked about that sheer animal horror. He spent one battle, he was in the Signal Corps, which meant passing messages. He actually was trained in carrier pigeons, as well as wireless, as well as physical messages. But one battle, he spent 50 hours straight without sleep. And he had to cross over the no man's land, which was always wet and marshy in northern France and Belgium, and would see the mutilated dead there in the mud, which he admitted in a letter, which was part of the, I wouldn't say inspiration, but part of the the background for the dead marshes. This idea of walking across and just all these faces in the mud.
Yeah,
and
I was going to
water.
say, it seems like there's a lot of imagery in Lord of the Rings that kind of evokes that idea of war, of the tearing down of the trees at Isengard,
Right.
and the leveling of the ground, where there's no grass and there's no trees, and it kind of
Right.
turns into a no man's land. And,
Mhm.
Yeah, he definitely had a number of images. He said in a letter that he didn't try to allegorically represent the war, but he tried to draw upon the emotions of the war
yeah,
and the destruction of the trees. Even some of the novelties of World War I. One was danger from above. It was the first time they had airplanes and zeppelins doing surveillance and doing bombing.
Yeah,
And in Lord of the Rings, you have to look up. Sauron has many spies, so you have to worry about the birds.
yeah.
And also the ring race in Siege of Gondor, they're on the backs of these winged steeds.
Yeah.
So you get this emotional feeling of danger from the air that you wouldn't have gotten in earlier wars.
Yeah, and World War I was strange in that it, like you mentioned with Dorothy Sayers and seeing the horse, like it sort of is this transition from, men riding on horseback to tanks
Yes.
and
Right.
sort of this
Yes.
transition. And so there was actually animals, killed and maimed and in the war and things like that. People's beloved animals and horses were used as weapons of war,
Right.
and then like Warren Lewis, he eventually got trained how to drive actual trucks and stuff.
Yeah,
They
military
shifted from,
transport.
yeah, they shifted from using horses to actual
Yeah.
here's how to drive a car, and here's how to fix an engine, but that was a new thing back then.
Wow.
Well, it stayed, the old transportation stayed crucial. When Hitler, when the Nazis went into Russia, they took more horses and draft animals with them than they did tanks.
Oh wow,
So animals were a big part of warfare through World War II.
yeah,
There was
Wow.
a cavalry charge by the Polish on horseback against the Nazis coming into Poland.
Mm.
There are a couple other things in Lord of the Rings that I wanted to mention. If you look at World War I propaganda posters, they have these German Huns who are the Bosch or the Huns, and they have these long ape-like arms, and they're hairy, and they have jagged teeth.
Oh.
And I believe his imagery for orcs comes partly from all this World War I propaganda about the Huns. He also is the first book I can think of where he spends so much time on recovery from battle. Both Lewis and Tolkien spent more time in hospitals than they did on the front line. Lewis got trench fever first and had to go to the hospital. That was carried by the lice in the trenches,
yeah,
pyrexia. And then he went back to the front line and was wounded by friendly fire by an English shell that fell short.
yeah,
And so he spent more time in the hospital than he did on the front lines, as did Tolkien. He also got pyrexia, and it's very hard to shake. It's kind of like chronic fatigue syndrome.
huh,
And so he spent most of the war behind the lines in hospitals or in kind of semi-invalid duty.
huh,
And in Lord of the Rings, there's this long scene after the flight to the ford in Rivendell where he's
yeah.
in bed and people are coming to visit him in bed.
yeah,
And the same thing after the big battle in front of Minas Tirith.
yeah,
They spend a lot of time in the houses of healing, and Aragorn shows off his ability as a king to heal people. But psychologically, I think he thought it wasn't just about battle. It was about the effects of battle and recovering from battle.
yeah. Well, and it's interesting that element of healing, and particularly female characters in both of those stories are Lord of the Rings and Chronicles of Narnia, have there's some sort of healing element to it that the women are participating in, and because women nurses were, played a big role in World War I.
Right.
Well, people will be surprised to learn that Sayers was actually thinking of going to France as a nurse because she wasn't that
Oh.
interested in.
That would have been a mistake.
But her specialty at Oxford was French. And when she went to France and when the war broke out, one of the things she kept writing back home is, oh, this person told me that I have a perfect French accent, that I don't speak French with a British accent. And so she's quite proud of that. And she thought, well, what can I do to help the war? Well, I could go and minister to all these soldiers that are coming back from the trenches. And she didn't hold on to that idea for very long. And I think probably anybody who knew her said, no, Dorothy.
Not necessarily her gifting.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Did you already say that Peter Wimsey suffers from
Yes, I did.
PTSD? Yeah, that came up in her novels. I thought her husband had some symptoms of.
Yes, but she didn't meet him till about 1926.
Oh.
And that was after she had written her first couple novels.
Well, Lewis had a strange experience with his adoptive mother, Janie Moore's brother, Doc Askins, who'd been in the war. And he was also dabbling in the occult, and there's a lot going on, but he had this complete nervous breakdown, and he thought that demons were trying to drag him down to hell, and eventually died of a heart attack in his 40s.
Wow.
And Lewis was there at his side for 2 weeks, and he felt like he was almost witnessing this psychic collapse brought on by some kind of dark spiritual forces. And a lot of the vivid imagery of the unman and Paralandra, some of the scenes of almost this idiocy and that hideous strength of Frost and Wither, who've lost they're kind of be a mental residue, but their humanity seems to be gone.
Yeah.
I think some of that vivid imagery of evil comes from his experience of watching someone who, there seems to be some PTSD involved in Dr. Askin's collapse as well.
Didn't Lewis's wounding in World War I, didn't that, he writes about that in terms of his recognition that he had a self, he had a soul, that kind of, how did that impact Lewis in that moment? Because that was a key moment in his life.
Right. Well, he had a period, if you ever read Spirits and Bondage, there's some really good war poetry in that collection. The first thing he wrote, that was published in 1919, here he is as a 20-year-old, he's a published poet and he's a wounded war veteran. He really had an amazing early life.
Yeah.
Not to mention losing his mother and the trauma of boarding schools. But the first thing he thought was when a bullet went whizzing by his head, he goes, this is war. This is what Homer wrote about.
Oh.
There are people trying to kill me. There's people across the way that are trying to kill me.
Yeah.
And so he was really struck by the idea that your flesh, here's your spirit and your consciousness and all your memory and all your reading, but here's somebody trying to destroy your flesh by shooting you with a bullet or blowing you up with a bomb.
Oh.
So a lot of the 20s, he was an idealist. He had this idea that we have this spark of divinity in us, and he actually called the material world Satan. It just wants you to breed and fight and eat, and it's really the spirit. Now he's
so kind of this Manichaean view of good versus evil.
It's also Schopenhauer. Kirkpatrick was very into the German philosopher Schopenhauer, who had a very strong sense of spirit versus flesh. And the best way to be spiritual is to cultivate the arts and creativity and not give in to indulgence of the flesh.
Right, because Lewis has that famous line that I never sank so low as to pray in the trenches.
Oh.
Right.
So it's not as though these experiences of the Great War helped turn him into a Christian. It was the fantasy of MacDonald that started that journey.
Right, and then meeting Tolkien and other Christians at Oxford. And once again, they were all veterans, so they knew what he was talking about. As I mentioned earlier, he was wounded in 3 places by friendly fire, by English shrapnel, one in the back of his hand and one in his chest and one in his arm. And later on, the piece of shrapnel that was in his chest was so close to his heart, it had to be surgically removed. Matter of fact, that was during World War II. And Lewis wrote in a letter, that piece of shrapnel sat so close to my heart all those years like unconfessed sin.
Wow.
Only Lewis could turn a shrapnel wound into a spiritual metaphor.
Wow. Well, and we were talking about what they called shell shock back then, what we call PTSD. Didn't Lewis's friend Barfield write about shell shock?
He did. I just discovered a great story by Barfield called The Devastated Area. And it's a stream of consciousness about a veteran who's gone home and gotten married, and he understands that nobody realizes what he went through, including his new wife. She wants him just to forget about it and move on. But it has really graphic imagery. It's a very good story. I'm surprised it isn't published more as a war story or a PTSD story.
You mean graphic imagery of the war itself?
Yeah, he's back at home in England, and he had this wonderful memory of getting demobilized, getting on the trains, finally arriving in Victoria Station and meeting his fiancée. But then it's so much he can't put it behind him. His wife just wants him to say, "Oh, well, that's all over, dear. You're fine now." And he's trying to go to sleep, and he's remembering a person right next to him getting the top of his skull blown off, and he's actually looking into his skull. And he says, "We got so insensitive, we made jokes about it." Somebody said, "How's Adamson doing these days?" The guy who got his head blown off, and he says, "Oh, he's top hole," which is British slang for doing fine, but. And then his wife is horrified that he could make jokes about that kind of thing.
But you almost had to.
As a coping mechanism or something.
Right.
Yeah.
To harden your sensibilities.
Yeah, you see this in documentaries or films like The Pacific about World War II,
Yeah.
where you have to harden yourself and make jokes about it. Barfield also served. He was also a signal officer, but he was fascinated by the wireless. So he mainly worked with radio traffic.
Oh, okay.
Before the war, he and his brother discovered that they could make those little radio sets, those homemade radio sets, like a crystal.
Yeah.
And they would pick up Morse code coming from the Eiffel Tower in French, which was the news. And they thought it was so wonderful to listen to the news in French by Morse code. They said, boy, technology has gotten so advanced. We're hearing the current news from Paris. And little did he know how much more advancement there would be in his lifetime.
Wow.
Yeah.
So he was already fascinated by electricity.
So he served in the Signal Corps and did like technology related things.
He was
so he wasn't
behind
on
the
the
lines.
front trenches.
Right. But he definitely knew the story, from his fellow veterans, because it's an amazingly vivid depiction of PTSD.
Yeah.
He talks about the loneliness is so physical because nobody understands where he's at. He's in this kind of bubble, and he says it was as physical as hunger, this feeling that nobody could connect with him.
Oh, wow.
Even his wife's voice has this kind of tinny sound. It's like he's watching her on TV, or he wouldn't use that analogy.
Yeah.
I was surprised what a vivid story it was.
Now, didn't someone, or maybe did they, call their debate about Christianity the Great War?
Yeah. Now, that's talking about using humor again. They just come through this horrible war followed by the Spanish flu. And Barfield was more and more interested in Rudolf Steiner and anthroposophy, which is kind of an alternative spirituality to Christianity. It somewhat maps onto Christianity. Barfield thought he was a Christian, but Lewis wasn't so sure. But they had a long discussion about whether imagination can reveal truth. And Barfield thought it could, and Lewis thought it could illustrate truth, or it could give meaning to truth, but it couldn't discover
Lead
truth.
to truth.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So they have this long, go ahead.
I was going to say that goes back to that discussion we had on the Romanticism podcast.
Right.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And they called it the Great War because there's literally book-length correspondence of this very intense philosophical analysis.
Yes.
So which one of them coined it, the Great War?
I would imagine Lewis. He had a sense of humor for that kind of thing. But it is a book-length correspondence edited by Lionel Adey, A-D-E-Y, if you want to dig into that. And part of what's interesting about Barfield is he came out of the war being very modernist, just like you would expect. This story reads like something that T.S. Eliot might have written if he'd written fiction.
Oh, wow.
But he got it published in Eliot's journal Criterion. But in the mid-20s, he said, I don't want to spend my career just writing about these broken down sensibilities. I want to talk about how to repair consciousness. And it's too easy in a way just to talk about we've just lost all sense of coherence and integration. So in many ways, his lifelong project of the evolution of consciousness had to do with recovering from the post-World War I consciousness, which is what Eliot called dissociation of sensibility.
Yeah.
That ideas and imagination have been broken apart, intellect and imagination, feeling and reason have been disintegrated.
Yeah.
But
That's
his
really
idea was
good,
true.
David. I hadn't thought of how the Great War would be a context for his attraction to anthroposophy.
Yeah.
Could you repeat that again? What'd you say? That was
That was
really
a-
good?
David,
Yeah, that was an okay idea, David.
he also,
A great idea.
Barfield has an essay an article that he wrote around the time of the Great Depression. And you can see that theme in there because his main argument is the problem with the Great Depression and all these monetary policies is that the most fundamental thing is the relationship and trust between two human beings. And when that breaks down, then of course we're going to have all these money issues, but you have to have that sort of fundamental relationship between two people that has something to do and that sort of makes you aware of your consciousness and all those kinds of things. So you can see him wrestling with that even in the Great Depression. So it's another, conflict, but this one's a financial as opposed to a war, but he still kind of returns to that theme.
Right.
So it's interesting to see that in Barfield. Yeah, that's I like that idea.
You just undermined an observation you made before we started the podcast.
What was that?
You said when you use the word great, that usually means wonderful.
Oh, that's
awesome.
true, yeah.
And the Great War is unusual because it was great in that it was so global and so horrific.
Yeah.
And then you said, we don't use that word. And then you said the Great Depression.
Well, we use that as a term to refer to the Great Depression, but we're going to cut this part out. But I don't know that today we would call it, if we had a Great Depression, we wouldn't call it the Great Depression, is what I'm trying to say.
Well, they called the 1908 downturn the Great Recession. And that was a riff on the Great Depression.
Oh.
It was one of the worst economic
Interesting.
situations we've
I
had.
wonder
But you're
if-
right. Let's
not-
go. Let's.
I wonder if the word great was just like one of those popular words back then, like today people, it's like awesome was big in the 80s or whatever.
Right.
You know what
sure.
I mean?
Those filler words. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, Lewis, when he would write to young writers, he would say, try to avoid using overly emphatic adjectives. If you say, oh, that's infinitely wonderful, how are you going to describe something that really is infinite?
Right.
And I think if you start overusing great, it ceases to be great.
Yeah.
Mm.
Well, what about our other authors besides Lewis, Tolkien, and Barfield? Who do we have
And
left?
Sayers.
And Sayers. What about Charles Williams?
He was not medically fit. He'd had rheumatic fever and had very bad eyesight. So he and T.S. Eliot both wanted to fight in the war, but were not considered to be medically fit enough to go on the battle lines. The main thing for Williams is losing friends. We haven't mentioned Lewis came to Keble College as a cadet to be training, and the other 4 people, including his good friend Patty Moore, were all killed in the war.
Yeah.
Tolkien had 3 other good friends that he had this tea society with in prep school,
Yeah.
and 2 of the 4 were killed in the war. And Williams had a couple of very close friends killed in the war. He has some poems and stories about still hearing their voices. So I think for many of them, it wasn't just the personal experience, it was the grieving the loss of friends.
I bet.
As I say, both France and Britain, especially officers were killed in a higher percentage than enlisted men because they were supposed to lead the charge.
Oh.
The generals were very slow to notice that time had passed since Napoleon. They still had the big frontal assault,
Yeah.
but now both sides had rifled guns. They had breech loaders, which
Yeah.
you can load much quicker than muzzle loaders.
And machine guns.
And barbed wire.
And airplanes.
And grenades.
Right. After one battle, they should have said, we're going to have to rethink our combat tactics.
Yeah,
But
definitely.
they said, well, let's try it again. What's depressing about World War I is they have the first battle of the Marne, the second, and many of them it's the third battle. There's a place in Italy where they have the 10th battle of Vianzo.
Wow.
Oh,
They just
wow.
kept trying over and over. It's very static warfare.
Yeah.
But they kept just trying to advance on each other's trenches. And normally you'd blow the whistle and then the officer would lead the charge. So here's 10,000 men going across no man's land to well-prepared defenders. One battle on July 1st, there were 20,000 casualties in one day, British casualties.
Mm.
And the officers had a death rate of 1 in 4 because they led the charge.
Mm.
Wow.
Mm.
And by World War II, you sit in your Jeep with binoculars seeing how things are going. It's a much
I
better
know.
place to be than leading
Yeah.
the charge.
Yeah, but
Mm.
it is crazy to think about the impact that the loss of all those lives had on everybody. I mean, you think about Lewis. He spent all those years living with Mrs. Moore because Patty died in the war, and he made that promise to him. That shaped the rest of his life.
It
You know.
did.
Yeah,
It was a life-changing
that's right.
situation.
That's right.
Some people think that in the last battle, when there's the civil war going on in Narnia,
Uh huh.
and the unicorns come to the rescue, and they all come over a ridge, and the dwarves get out their arrows and just mow down the unicorns before they can even reach the battlefield. And some critics think that image of the entire row of unicorns being mowed down before they could even come to grips with the enemy is Lewis's memory of trench warfare and these futile assaults against the defenders.
Wow.
Well, the one author at the Wade we haven't talked about yet, to answer your question, Aaron, is G.K. Chesterton.
Yeah.
He was a generation earlier than the other Wade authors, except for MacDonald. So he was 40 when World War I broke out.
Gotcha.
And his girth made it unlikely for him to go to war. In fact, David, what's that famous line?
Well, there's a lot of pressure when a war starts to, you're a coward if you don't sign up.
Yeah.
Tolkien felt this pressure. He wanted to finish his degree before he enlisted.
Yeah.
And people really criticized him for that. So a woman went up to Chesterton and said, "Sir, why aren't you out at the front?" And he turned sideways and said, "If you'll look, madam, you'll see that I am out at the front." He weighed like 300 pounds. He was a big man.
Oh, wow.
He also had a great quote about the meaning of the war. Some people felt there was all this optimism that we're going to have peace. There's going to be no more great wars. And so they would say, well, it just shows the failure of Christianity that they weren't able to improve society. And his view was, well, what about original sin? This is the kind of thing that Christians would predict, that we can't fix society through human reforms. So his famous line was to say, people say that World War One discredited, well, he probably called it the Great War. People say the Great War discredited Christianity, but that's like saying the flood discredited the ark.
Well, he had a verbal battle with H.G. Wells in response to Wells' statement that we mentioned earlier that this was the war to end wars.
Oh.
And Chesterton said that's like saying this is the work that will end all work. So he was very aware of human nature, which of course is a fundamental element of Christianity. That people are self-serving and grasping after power.
Yeah.
He also said that the only defensible war is a war of defense.
Huh.
So he did not advocate starting wars. He would have trouble with kind of an imperialistic, we're going to go take over this country for its resources. And the Boer Wars were a little bit like that. But he was a total supporter of World War I. And both of you have mentioned the romanticism of going off to war. Chesterton's little brother, Cecil, was in love with a woman that he worked with, and she only agreed to marry Cecil if Cecil went to the front, if he enlisted. And so Cecil did enlist. He was invalided out, but as soon as he got well, he re-enlisted again because to validate his contribution to World War I. And I think a lot of people felt that way.
There were women that would go around and would pin. I can't remember what they would pin. They would pin
a white feather or something.
Pin a feather or something
right.
on men who weren't out at the war, even if they were like Chesterton's age or something. And you got to think that, like, it was just this going around, and like maybe maybe it happened to Williams, and just that intense pressure to go and enlist in the war.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, well, T.S. Eliot tried the Army and the Navy, and then he tried to go in as a U.S. citizen, as a British citizen. He really wanted to be a war veteran. Another great Chesterton quote on the war, he says, "We shouldn't fight because we hate what's in front of us. We should fight because we love what's behind us." And that sentiment shows up. I'm not sure if he got it from Chesterton, but Tolkien's character of Faramir says, you know, I don't fight for the glitter of the sword or the glory. I fight to protect everything that I love.
Yeah.
And I wonder if he was channeling some Chesterton there in that character of Faramir.
Huh.
Well, Chesterton and his brother Cecil were such patriotic advocates of the cause of Britain that Cecil actually went to America to try to encourage Americans to join the war because it's like the Brits recognized they needed more power.
Yeah.
And Keith Chesterton, he went to Ireland to recruit the Irish to fight in the war. And that was very controversial because right as World War I, the Great War, broke out, the Irish were fighting for self-rule.
Right.
Yeah.
And the Irish thought the Germans would come to their side because the Irish wanted to separate from England.
Yeah.
And Chesterton felt really strongly that you should not have a arbitrary draft, and he thought we need moral suasion. So he actually went over to Ireland and tried to convince people to join.
Wow.
You know what works better than moral suasion?
What?
Conscription.
Oh.
You make them come by law. Well, Lewis's case was interesting because he was in Northern Ireland, which was not a separate country then. And as a resident of Ireland, he wasn't required to fight in the war. But the Northern Irish were very tied to England. They're Protestant. They're dependent upon England somewhat for their safety. But in World War II, Ireland was neutral. They did not want to be a part of England's war. So they were surprisingly factor in World War II. They wouldn't even let the British base their ships in Ireland to protect their convoys.
Yeah.
Many experienced results of the war, not just through the shell shock, but the disruption of education at Oxford.
Right.
When Sayers came back, and she sent this friend of hers who basically had a nervous breakdown while she was in France and the war was declared. She sent Elsie, and they had a chaperone accompanying them, back to her home, and Sayers stayed in France. But we have no letters from that time, so we don't know how long she stayed. before she came back. But she got back in time for her last term at Oxford, and Somerville College, where she went, had been totally appropriated as a hospital.
Oh, wow.
So there were no places to stay anymore, no classrooms. And so she had to live in Oriel College for a while.
Huh.
So, but here were all these soldiers returning from the front who were traumatized. So Sayers saw it in her woman friend, her college friend, the nervous breakdown. And then she also saw it in soldiers, including her own relatives. So what's interesting about her first novel is it focuses on a specialist in nervous disorders. But someone who's more like the modernists that, David, you were talking about earlier, that he attributes it not to emotional or spiritual issues, it's all about the glands. And so if you just fix the body, you fix the emotional problem.
Interesting.
Back to Chesterton, he and his brother, and he was very, very close.
Who was killed in the war, or who died in the war. Did you mention that?
Well, his brother Cecil, when he went back the second time, after he was invalided out the first time, he got nephritis, which is a problem with your kidneys. And he died not long after the armistice.
Oh, wow.
Which is, of course, the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, November 11th.
Which used to be called Armistice Day until World War II. And then there's no point in celebrating an armistice if you've had more wars. So then it would change to Veterans Day.
Even Sayers' second novel has part of the mystery is solved in terms of a poppy that people wear to celebrate what we in America call Veterans Day. They call,
to commemorate, because the Flanders Fields is the famous poem about poppies growing in the fields.
So even when we were in England leading student groups in the 1980s, people were still selling those paper poppies for Armistice Day.
Yeah, they still wear them in England.
Yeah.
Right.
I saw a number of them recently because it was in November.
Oh.
People were posting about it and things like that. Yeah, definitely.
I was reading about the war in France. The guy was writing in the late 70s, and he said on public transportation there would be a handicap seat, and would say for les grands mutilés de la guerre, meaning mutilated soldiers from World War I had a special place on buses in the 70s in France.
Oh, wow.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. One of the things that Chesterton did in 1917, so the war had been going on for several years now, he wrote what he called a short history of England, where he tried to eliminate any sense that the British had Teutonic blood. And of course, most histories, we recognize that Anglo-Saxon invasion, and he wanted to just clear the British blood of anything German. And so most people recognize it's horrible history, but he is responding to his sense of the horrific things that Germans had been doing.
Wow.
There's a letter from Tolkien where he talks about Hitler perverting the great northern spirit. But he got a letter after the war when The Hobbit was published that Germany under Hitler didn't allow Jewish authors to publish books. So someone wrote him in England and said, "We love The Hobbit. We'd like to translate it into German. Could you just confirm that you are the Irish race, meaning Aryan or German?" And he wrote and said, "Well, I'm not really Irish because I'm not Persian. Technically, Aryanism." But then he said, "You seem to be asking whether or not I'm Jewish. No, I am not a member of that admirable race. My background is German. But if I keep receiving impertinent letters like this one, I'm going to be ashamed of my heritage." So it was a great comeback.
It's interesting you bring up World War II, because especially for the Brits, and our 6 authors who lived through 2 world wars.
Right, 20 years apart.
Yeah, it's just hard to imagine.
I wanted to mention, going back to Tolkien, that he wasn't very pleased with his service. He never really came to grips with the enemy. Lewis was more or less satisfied with himself as a military veteran. In Out of the Silent Planet, he says that Ransom discovered that he had rather more courage and reserve than expected. Whereas Tolkien writes in letters and says, "I had too much imagination and not enough courage. And he describes himself at one point as baggage because he was so often weak and wounded. He needed to be carried around on a litter. And it's interesting to me in Lord of the Rings that the hobbits, before they really get a chance to make their contribution, they say, oh, I'm just luggage. I shouldn't even be here. I have nothing to contribute. Tolkien said of Faramir, he says, the character I most identify with is Faramir, except I don't have his courage.
Wow.
And it's interesting how often, if you look at courage and faint-heartedness in Lord of the Rings, when they first go to breathe, there's nothing happening, but Sam imagines he sees black horses and the riders looking out the windows. And there's a lot of emphasis upon fear. When Elrond sends the 9 walkers out on their quest, he says, I don't put you under any oath, for you do not know the strength of your own hearts. And Gimli objects, well, anybody who would, and they have this proverb contest about faint-heartedness.
Yeah.
And even after the big battle, when they're going to challenge Sauron in his own fortress, some of the young men just aren't up to it. And Aragorn, rather than scolding them or putting them up for treason, he says, well, why don't you go do this other small military task? And it's to allow them to rescue their pride. And he says some of them were so ashamed of his generosity that they stayed with the main battle group, but others went and did this other military task.
Interesting.
And it's interesting to me how sympathetic he is with the faint of heart. He seemed to know that not everybody is built to be out there on the battlefield with shells whizzing by and still not, being totally traumatized.
That hero that just stands there. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, we can't all be Aragorns. Some of us are Pippins and Marys and Sams.
Yeah, this is true. Yeah, that is a big theme in Lord of the Rings, is that like courage or the lack thereof.
Right.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Well, George MacDonald said to try and act brave is to be brave. And we
it's
see
like
that also.
Lewis's idea of pretending
Yeah, it
in
is
the
like
Four
pretending.
Loves.
Right.
Hmm.
And Peter, before he has to do battle with Fenris Ulf, he says he felt sick to his stomach and he felt weak, but he did it anyway. And once again, you have to overcome these feelings of fear to accomplish your mission.
Yeah, and that's so much more profoundly human than the superhero movies we get today, where people will have no second thoughts and they just jump up and chop off the head of an enemy and everything is reduced to these black and white categories. I mean, even Chesterton wanting to write German blood out of British history is recognizing how complicated this all is. And even after America joined the war in April of 1917, so they were only in it for, a year? Little over a year. Yeah, because
declared in
November 11th, 18.
Year and a half or something like that.
Actually, most people say they turned the tide. Both the Germans and the Ottoman Empire were exhausted, the Central Powers, and the Allies were exhausted. And the summer of 1918, the Americans were adding 10,000 soldiers a day to the battlefield.
Wow.
So that's a huge shot in the arm for the Allies.
Right, right.
So they didn't do the lion's share of the fighting, but they came in at a very opportune moment to help turn the tide in favor of the Allies.
Right. Well, one of the things Chesterton did is he wrote an essay for an American journal, which was published in December of 1917, so just half a year after America joined. And it's a very odd essay. It's called The Plan for a New War. And it starts out by saying the proposal for another European war to follow after a reasonable interval upon the conclusion of this one is one which can evidently claim many influential adherents. And it's hard to tell what he's doing. He's criticizing people who are suggesting that another war is coming along. But if you read it, it sounds prophetic in that he ends by saying, and he might be responding to pacifists who are trying to end the Great War by suggesting another war will happen. But his last paragraph says, for though I know that the new pacifists will laugh at my sentimentality, I cannot for the life of me overcome a weakness of repugnance at the thought of these horrors being so soon and so systematically repeated. There seems almost, if I may dare to hint at such a thing a little mean in passing our own last days in a recuperative rest camp when we have already loaded the huge weapons and set up the horrible war engines which are to torture and dismember the children now playing in the nurseries and the lanes, which is exactly what happened.
Wow.
The children of the people who fought in World War I
Yeah.
were fighting in World War II.
As I read that essay, you showed it to me, and I think it's ironic, like a modest proposal, because he's saying, let's start planning for the next war right in the middle of the Great War. And I think he was satirizing that war to end all wars idea.
Yeah. Oh, he did
That
it like
given human
Wells.
nature,
Yeah.
people's patriotism, they're sure that their country is right. Even the economics of war, he has some comments about how capitalists are doing quite well. America came out of the war, actually, both wars. Economically, it was a benefit to America to be so invested in the war.
Yeah.
Even in World War I, America supplied 80% of the oil to the Allies and invested as much money in basically 1 year of involvement as Great Britain and Germany had in their entire involvement in the war.
Wow.
So it was a huge outflow of money, resources. And so I think he's satirizing that idea of the war that's going to end. And of course, he was dead right. 20 years later, the same powers.
Another
were aligned.
generation comes along that doesn't remember, didn't live through the first war. And
yeah, I think it was mainly Germany got organized as a major nation late, and everybody else had an empire.
Yeah.
And they felt like they hadn't gotten their share of the pie.
Yeah.
So I think you could argue that World War I and II are parts of the same general movement of Germany to take a dominant place on the European continent.
Yeah, definitely. There's a number of fascinating books, one of which I read that's about Germany in the 1920s, Berlin in the 1920s. And it starts at the end of World War I, and it basically sort of documents how kind of like nobody was really in charge, and the whole 11th hour on the 11th day thing wasn't some heroic thing. It was just happened to be sort of a deadline that was given to them for surrendering, and how just haphazard things were in Germany in the 1920s. And you can kind of see how it just inevitably leads into the 30s and then into World War II. So
it also led to the myth that the Germans had been betrayed. Hitler really jumped on this idea. That we didn't lose it on the battlefield. Our politicians and those Jewish capitalists, they all stabbed us in the back.
Yeah.
So it definitely, well, it was interesting because all of these great old dynasties all disappeared in World War I. The Kaiser and the Romanovs in Russia.
Yeah.
There was an Ottoman dynasty. And so the Weimar Republic was very, the Habsburgs.
Yeah, there was a huge political vacuum.
Right.
Yeah.
And I could see how the Nazis moved into that.
Yeah. And you mentioned some things from Lord of the Rings. It makes me want to go back and read some of their novels and see maybe places where their insights and the experiences from the war have leaked through into the things that they talk about. So, Crystal and David, why talk about the Great War? How does this relate to us today, and particularly this time of year? How does all of this help us understand the Wade authors better?
Well, some people might think it's strange that we are doing a podcast on World War I as part of the Advent season, but we see this as the very reason that God needed to come in the flesh because of human sin that not only separated humans from their creator, but also led to death and mayhem.
Yeah.
Isn't it interesting that not long after the Genesis account of the fall, we get the next generation where Cain kills Abel.
Yeah.
And so many of the wars that are fought, this was definitely true of the Civil War, it's about brother killing brother.
Yeah.
So this prepares us then for our next podcast that will be available on Christmas Day, which is about the importance of the incarnation.
Yeah, definitely.
I think in The Hideous Strength, you see this manipulation of patriotism. The people at NICE say the first two world wars were the first of several. So they're organizing or orchestrating war. And they're often using xenophobia and patriotism. So one lesson that I would take away from our authors, they didn't follow the general disillusionment following the war because as Christians, making a perfect society was never on their agenda. Lewis says if you shoot for heaven, all these wonderful things will happen on earth. But if you shoot for heaven on earth, then everything's going to fall apart. So part of my takeaway would be never expect earthly structures to bring the kind of utopia that you are hoping for. That was the great Russian mistake. If we only wipe out this entire class of people, millions of people, we're going to have a utopian society, dictatorship of the proletariat.
Yeah.
And they got all the massacring done, but they didn't get the utopian building done. Same thing happened in the French Revolution. So I think as Christians, we should always be suspicious of these kind of collectivist solutions. I think they also were less inclined to get into patriotism. There's a lot of religious substitutes for just religion. Good and evil cut through each one of us rather than we're the good guys and they're the bad guys. So I think they both teach us not to think America is the greatest country or English is the greatest country. That idea of exceptionalism is kind of a substitute for genuine religion. But there is no abiding city on earth. The city of man will always be flawed.
Yeah. Like one of the chapters of my Sayers book, which just came out, is The Politics of Religion and the Religion of Politics. And I look at how Sayers grapples with those in ways you're talking about, how people have substituted politics for their religion and turned it into easy categories of good guys, bad guys, versus Sayers, who in her radio plays about Jesus, which were produced during World War II, she compares both the radicals on the left, who are the zealots, she compares them to Nazis, but she also compares the Sanhedrin on the right, who are trying to protect the status quo, to the Nazis.
Interesting.
And she's questioning polarized interpretations of history.
Gotcha.
And she explicitly says that the people who lived in Jesus' day were very little different than those of us in our own time.
Yeah. That is an interesting insight that something about human nature manages to always stay the same. Definitely.
Yeah.
I think it's called original sin. I think they've covered that.
Yes, definitely.
Yeah. So that's going to give them a different perspective on the war.
Definitely. Well, thank you guys for letting me join you and talking about this topic. I was excited when you mentioned the piece by Barfield, David. What was that again?
It's called The Devastated Area, and it's in a Barfield sampler, edited by G.B. Tennyson, an old professor of mine at UCLA.
Okay.
And it's really an excellent piece of work. I'm really surprised it's not more widely known. It's chilling, it's devastating, but it's very vividly written.
All right. Well, thank you guys. And
Thank you.
yeah, if you haven't checked out some of the other podcasts, go back and look at those, and we'll see you guys next time around. Thank you.
We've had a lot of good podcasts, but I consider this to be a great podcast.
Nice.
The Wade Center podcast is a production of the Marion E. Wade Center at Wheaton College in Wheaton, Illinois. Our hosts are the co-directors of the Wade Center, Drs. Crystal and David C. Downing. Our episodes are produced and edited by Aaron M. Hill. If you enjoy the podcast and the content we offer, please leave us a review on iTunes, tell your friends, and consider making a donation to the Wade. The Wade Center is entirely self-funded. Financial gifts help support the expert services, vast collections, and varied programming we offer at no cost. If you have questions about the podcast or suggestions for future episodes, please email us at wade@wheaton.edu or contact us via Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube. To learn more about the Wade Center, our 7 British Christian authors, what we offer, and how to make a donation, visit our website at wheaton.edu/Wade.